friends, welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the Chapter Conundrum. And in today's video, I want to do my March wrap up. And we don't have a ton of books to talk about again this month, but there are still 5. And of the 5 that I read, a few of them were chunky. So even though I still read 5 books, same as February, I did manage more pages last month. It was about 2,300 pages. I'll put it on the screen if anyone is curious, which for me is not a lot, but lately I have just not been reading as much as I usually do and I'm used to reading. And considering I did manage to finish out my TBR for the March Mavericks readathon, that feels like a win. April, I'm hoping, will be a lot heavier, and so far I'm off to a good start with that. So fingers crossed that that keeps going to plan. But the first book we have to talk about today is A Puzzle House by Duncan Ralston. And this is an indie horror set in an escape room. Essentially, the premise of this is you have several strangers who are being called to a dead puzzle master's house in order to potentially get some inheritance from his estate. And for the most part, they don't really understand like why they're involved in this until they get to the house. And essentially they are supposed to go through a series of like escape rooms, or the puzzle house, if you will, in order to potentially claim that inheritance. So this had a very strong premise for me, and I also thought that the book started out very strongly as well. I really enjoyed the way that the characters were introduced. Immediately, I thought we got a lot of their experience and also got to have some theories on why they were potentially selected and maybe how they related to the other characters. I found them all to be very memorable based on their introductions, and they were definitely very promising that way. Also, in the very first scene in the house, I did really enjoy that we kind of got to go through the experience of doing like an escape room sort of with some of the characters, trying to figure out what to do. And that was more or less what I was hoping for the entire book. However, sadly, a lot of the writing choices seem to kind of change towards the second half of the book. In the second half, I felt like the story really took some turns, most of which I was fine with, but there was one in particular that I had a hard time with that really kind of tanked my enjoyment a little bit. I also felt like we stopped focusing on the clues in the puzzle house, which was kind of the main draw or the most important aspect to me for this, and so that was kind of disappointing for me. And we also just kind of got less detail and stuff up front, so when things did happen, I wasn't as emotionally moved or affected by them in the moment. It was more like you got information as to the ramifications of that thing in hindsight. And that's definitely a writing style that a lot of people can enjoy, but it's definitely not my preference, and so that did affect my enjoyment as well. Overall, I decided to give this a 3-star rating. Oh, and I also did really enjoy that some of the like escape house puzzles in this kind of pulled from mythology and lore. I thought that was really cool, and I wanted a whole ton more of that and less of more like the action movie that was reminiscent of Saw, if you will. If what I had to say about this sounds like it's up your alley, definitely I would still recommend it. It's a worthwhile read. But on the other hand, if you're more interested solely based on the premise of this, I would highly recommend Escape by Ian Rob Wright instead. That was more of a 4.5 to 5-star escape room horror that I enjoyed a whole lot more than this. Next up, I picked up Rebel Witch by Kristen Ciccarelli, and this is the sequel to Heartless Hunter, or in the UK, Crimson Moth. It is the second and final book in the Crimson Moth duology series, and I liked this quite a bit. I didn't like it quite as much as book 1, but before we get into all that, I should probably give you guys the gist of what this series is about. So I obviously can't tell you too much about this particular book given that it's a sequel, but in the series you have a witch and a witch hunter who are dating each other sort of for their own gains, and they are kind of keeping their cards a little bit close to their chest. So essentially the witch is a vigilante witch called the Crimson Moth who helps other witches escape, because in this world, it is not okay to be a witch and witches are arrested. Now, the person she's dating is kind of higher up on the hierarchy of like people who are capturing the witches, like he's a prominent witch hunter. And essentially, she's dating him to try and find out more information about potentially where witches are being held and imprisoned so she can help them escape. And he is dating her to kind of suss out whether she's potentially the Crimson Moth, this vigilante witch who is freeing the witches he's helping capture. So definitely you can tell right from the start of that premise, this series has a ton of tension, and it's definitely fun to see a romance slowly develop with those parameters going on as well, because there's obviously a lot of outside things affecting everything, and it's very, very full of tension. So on to Rebel Witch more, my thoughts with this. I thought that this was a very satisfying conclusion to the story. There was really nothing that I really cared about that went unanswered, and I appreciated it for that reason. I definitely thought Kristen Ciccarelli took time to think things out, and it showed, even in hindsight, like some of the foreshadowing on book 1 came to fruition with things in this book, and I loved that. I basically have the same kind of feedback on this that I did with book 1, where I do wish this series was a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more intricate. I kind of wanted more in terms of the character thought processes, their backstories, more of like a deeper look into the hard things they were going through. And overall, I understand that, you know, this was written kind of as like YA in North America and it's adult in UK. So I understand like not everyone wants to go to that depth and write at the adult level. But in book 1, I more felt it was mainly those aspects that kind of made it feel less adult and more into YA. In this book, there were some moments in the plot and kind of like some pacing moments where it was also apparent to me that this was YA. So yeah, I think that was the main thing that kind of made me enjoy this slightly less than book 1, because there were just a few things that felt a little bit rushed. But overall, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a very solid series, would definitely recommend. I really enjoyed the characters and the world building, and I absolutely loved that I got to have some pretty serious theories on several aspects of the plot and just reveals in general to come, and that the foreshadowing was on point. I ended up giving this one a 4.25 star, and if you missed my wrap up, I think December wrap up, the first book was a 4.5. So very close enjoyment wise. Still really enjoyed this and would definitely recommend the series. Moving on to another romantasy sequel, I also picked up Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros in March, the second Empyrean book, so sequel to Fourth Wing. And if you don't know about Fourth Wing yet somehow, essentially it is like a fantasy romance with dragon riders. You have a young girl, Violet, who is the daughter of the general, and she always kind of thought that she would go into more of like the scribe quadrant, and sort of thought she would have more of like a low-key scribe thing going on with her life. But her mother at the beginning of book 1 forces her to join the recruits for the Dragon Riders, and things go from there. There are definitely aspects to the story that add more tension to it than what I've described, but that's like the overall gist of the premise. So, Iron Flame, I definitely liked that the romance of the series progressed in this one. It was a fun adventure story that had really good tension and stakes. Like, you were definitely invested in the story reading this. However, this installment really made it clear and apparent that Rebecca Yarros is really not a fantasy author. She's more of a romance author. And what I mean by that is it was clear that she didn't really take the time to kind of plan out a lot of intricacy surrounding some fantastical elements of the story. So like the context towards the world building, for example, could definitely use a lot of work. And also foreshadowing was just lacking. It felt like there were a lot of things that were kind of randomly introduced to alter the story and the direction of it, and to give the reader feeling that could have been even more exciting had we got a lot of foreshadowing and build up to those aspects. There were also some things introduced that kind of had me question, like, does this make sense? So yeah, overall, it felt like there was a real lack of kind of planning and thought that went into some elements of the plot in this one. And so for that reason, I am kind of less excited on the series now than I was after Fourth Wing. I definitely sort of had that kind of like niggling vibe to some of those things in Fourth Wing, but Iron Flame is really where a lot of that became more apparent. So I will still say this was very enjoyable for the romantic elements. I just think it's definitely not necessarily the strongest romantasy for the fantasy elements. And even though I had those complaints, I still enjoyed the romantic aspects of this enough to rate this a 4-star. So next up, I picked up the brand new John Marrs release, You Killed Me First. And this was an interesting one, to say the least. So the premise of this is that you have a woman waking up bound and gagged in the middle of a bonfire. And right away from the very start, you have her answering a phone call with a like Bluetooth earpiece from the person that has put her in this predicament. And you don't know her identity in the beginning. You also don't know the identity of who put her there in the beginning. So then you kind of like backpedal and follow the story of three women in the same neighborhood and sort of their dynamic and relationship together, and just some shenanigans that goes on between them. True to John Marr's style, you definitely have some very unlikable characters that are not perfect people by any means, and they all have secrets from each other. So definitely those elements felt very familiar, and I enjoyed that bit. I also tend to love John Marr's pacing, and this I thought was well paced as well. Now, this is kind of where it all went a little bit imperfect for me. There's one element to this story, and I can't tell you what it is because it's very spoilery for the story as a whole, but it was something I really couldn't suspend my disbelief on. I thought that something similar to this could have made a lot more sense had it been handled slightly differently. But I think in particular in the audiobook, it was apparent that it wasn't sort of handled that way. And because of that, I did struggle a little bit with some of the plot points and reveals in the story. Now, that said, it was still a very satisfying story overall. And I think for somebody who didn't necessarily have that same kind of struggle that I did with this certain element in the story, you would love this book. But for me, it was solid. It wasn't amazing because of that, and I wound up giving this a 3.75 star rating. It definitely doesn't hold a candle to The Passengers for me, but it also wasn't my least favorite of his books. And I definitely thought it was interesting to check out his brand new release because most of what I had read from him was his earlier work. And so it was cool to kind of see some growth in terms of pacing and some writing choices that way too. And then lastly, I finished off the month with The Kingdom of Copper, the second book in the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty. And if you don't know about this series, this follows a couple different POVs. So the first one is Nari, and she is a con artist woman living in Cairo at the start of book one. And in one of her cons, she accidentally summons a jinn, and he is essentially escorting her to Daevabad in book one. And the other main POV you get in book one is Ali Zaid, and he is a prince of Daevabad, but he doesn't necessarily agree with a lot of the decisions that his father and his older brother are making for the city and the kingdom. So there's definitely some tension and political intrigue happening throughout the series that way. Obviously, I can't really tell you too much about what Kingdom of Copper is about, but that's kind of the general gist of the setup for the series. So, Kingdom of Copper. I definitely thought that this was an enjoyable sequel, and I think I liked it slightly less than book one, which I think is a bit of a hot take. Most people tend to prefer book two over book one. I did really enjoy that the political scope of this story expanded, but I think the reason that it didn't work quite as well for book one for me is that I was less forgiving of the fact that we got less context in terms of the world building and the magic and just some setup for some core things in the trilogy. In this one, I think in book one, I was a little bit more forgiving of that kind of missing because I was like, okay, well, explanations are probably coming in the sequels to these things, and it might make more sense in hindsight. And while there was some of that, we still had a lot of instances in this book where context was kind of lacking up front, and I wanted a lot more detail and nuance in terms of the world building here and magic too, for sure. I did also really enjoy that there were a lot of high stakes action scenes in this one, and that the ending left me with some good questions that I was curious about. There are things I don't know the outcome of yet that I am very eager to find out. However, there was also one aspect of the ending that felt really random for me, and I have no idea as to the explanation of how it happened or how it was possible. And I'm hoping that that gets addressed very early in book three, but it definitely did affect my enjoyment for book two. And I also thought that a lot of the action scenes weren't written in a way that was kind of for my preference. And what I mean by that is a lot of times in the moments with action, we had narrative that sort of was telling you what's going on, telling you what the characters were feeling about it, which was fantastic. But then you would also have moments where that is kind of interrupted to tell you about surroundings. And that was kind of less of an appeal for me because I felt like it kind of cut into the tension, since descriptions aren't something that I highly value. And I just wish that that kind of stuff was like introduced outside of action scenes, so it didn't kind of like make the flow of the action a little jarring. But again, that's a very personal preference thing, and I can completely understand why people enjoy this more than City of Brass. But for me, my enjoyment was slightly less. Still really solid, still recommend, and I gave this a 4-star rating. So that was it for the books I read in the month of March. Let me know down below in the comments, have you read any of these? Do you have similar thoughts and feelings to me, or very different thoughts and feelings to me on any of these? And also let me know, what was your favorite book for the month of March? Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a great day. Bye!